Lesson 10.4, Graphing Sine and Cosine Functions. Alright, so to graph these, here's sine. So notice, sine starts at 0 right there. The amplitude is 1. The amplitude is this distance between the middle and the highest point, or the distance between the middle and the lowest point. Both of those are amplitude. The period is 2 pi. A period is the distance to do a complete up and down. So that's one full cycle. The period is the distance of one cycle. So it goes over to 2 pi to make a full cycle. There's several key points. So where it starts, the end of the period, halfway over, so those are all the x-intercepts, highest point and lowest point. So notice they're all halves. So we have the full period of 2 pi. Halfway between that is the other x-intercept. Halfway between those are the highest and the lowest points. Cosine looks very similar. It's just sine but shifted. It starts at the highest point at 1. The amplitude is still 1. The distance between the middle and the highest is still the amplitude. And between the middle and the lowest point is the amplitude. And the period is also 2 pi. So one complete up and down. In this case, it's kind of split. But going back to where it's the same, that's 2 pi. The key points, so halfway between the two highest points, that would be 2 pi 1, and this is 0, 1. Halfway between that is the lowest point, which would be pi negative 1. Halfway between those are the x-intercepts at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Of course, we can transform the graphs of sine or cosine. So I'm just going to fill in all the letters at once. You should have known A previously, and the H and the K. Sometimes instead of H they use C, and sometimes instead of K they use D. I'm going to use H and K. The absolute value of A is the amplitude, which also happens to be the vertical stretch. If A is less than 0, then it's reflected over the x-axis, just like normal. B is a horizontal shrink, which changes our period. So the period is how far sideways it went. To repeat, so if B is a shrink, we take 2 pi, which was our period, and divided it by the absolute value of B. H is a horizontal shift, and K is a vertical shift. The midline, which is the middle line, so if we have this, that's the midline, is y equals k. Remember, the period is till it repeats, so that is the period, and that is the amplitude. Amplitude was A, period is 2 pi over B, and the midline is y equals k. So how do we actually go about sketching the graph of sine and cosine? Well, we have to identify all the letters, the A, the B, the H, and the K, so the amplitude, the period, horizontal shift, and vertical shift. Remember, amplitude was the A, the absolute value of A. Period is 2 pi over b. Horizontal shift was the h. Vertical shift was the k. So you draw the midline, which is y equals k. And you find the 5 key points, which include 3 zeros, 1 max, and 1 minimum. For sine, for cosine, it's 2 zeros, 2 maxes, and a minimum, but you can see it there in the graph. And remember, they're all split up evenly. So if you find the period, the first point and the last point, so where it starts and where it ends, halfway between that is the middle thing, and halfway between those points give you the other parts. And then after you have the points, you draw your graph. So let's start by looking at some graphs. It says identify the amplitude and the period. Well, the amplitude is the distance between the midline, which appears to be the x-axis, and the highest point. So the amplitude appears to be 5. The period is the distance to go from one point to the same place on the next. So it has one full up and down. So it's this distance there. So that point appears to be 2 pi. So our period is 2 pi. Why don't you pause this and try number 7. When you're done, the amplitude is 4 and the period is pi. So let's try graphing f of x equals 2 sine x. Well, if we compare this to a sine of b x minus h plus k, you can see that a is the 2, b isn't there, h isn't there, and k isn't there. So our amplitude is 2. Our period hasn't changed. It's 2 pi. Technically, b is 1, so it's 2 pi over 1. So it's a 1x. Our midline would be y equals k, but k is 0, because it's like plus 0. All right, so it's sine. Sine starts at 0. Now we need to do some labeling. I'm going to call this 2 pi, so that would be pi. This would be pi over 2, and 3 pi over 2. For fun, let's go by halves, so that'd be 1, 2, negative 1, negative 2. So if our amplitude is 2, well, let's start with our period. Our period is 2 pi, so it goes over to there. The other x-intercept is halfway in between. And halfway in between those is the maximum and the minimum. So our maximum is there at 2. The minimum's at negative 2. So it's going to come up, curl, go down, curl, go up. And then this just pattern just repeats. So it's going to go up, down, and it'll repeat the other direction also. Try to make them smooth corners here. Nothing sharp. It's a little easier to say than it is to do sometimes. And there you go. Nice little graph. Why don't you pause this video and try number 13. Graph y equals sine of 2 pi x. Here's 1, so the amplitude is 1. B is 2 pi, so our period is 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi over 2 pi, which is 1, so our period is 1. and then h is 0, k is 0. So our midline is the x-axis again. Sine, so I start at 0. Since it divides into 4 parts, I'm going to go all the way over to here to say we have 1. So here's a half. And our amplitude is 1. Oops. So that'd be there and there. So we're going to go up, around, and just follow the pattern. Like that. Let's try 2 sine of x minus pi over 2. All right, so here our a is 2, so that's our amplitude. The b is 1, so our period is 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi. H in this case, though, is pi over 2, so we shift pi over 2 to the right. And k is 0, so our midline is y equals 0, still the x-axis. All right, so what I would do first is I would just not worry about the shift. So I'm going to do everything except for the shift. So sine starts at 0, and our period is 2 pi, so I'll make over here be 2 pi. Halfway over is pi, pi over 2, and 3 pi over 2. So each space is pi over 2. Vertically, I'm going to go by halves. So my amplitude is 2. All right, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm not going to draw a nice graph. What I'm going to do is make it dotted, because this is not our final answer. Our final graph, we have to shift. So let me change colors. All right, we are going to shift everything pi over 2 to the right. So one space to the right. So that one goes over here. This one goes over here. That one goes over there. Goes there, there. This one goes there. This one goes there. Goes there, 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 there. And that one goes over there. So now we just draw our graph through these shifted points. So our final answer is the red graph. All right, why don't you try number 39? Pause it. The amplitude is 4. And it's negative, so it's reflected upside down. Our midline is y equals -1. Oops. Yeah. So that's our midline right there. and it's cosine, so it starts at a maximum, but it's also reflected. So instead of starting at a maximum, let's start at a minimum. So that was -1, this is -2, 3, 4, 5. So it's 4 spaces down from the midline. B is 1, so our period is still 2 pi. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to call this 2 pi. All right, so the other amplitude will be there. Halfway over will be the minimum. Remember, it's flipped upside down, though. And so our intercepts are going to be between those. So it's going to be, we haven't shifted yet, though. There is a shift, so I'm putting a dotted. Oops. I made a mistake, a small mistake. Should be there. And you could continue the pattern. Like that. All right, our last thing is this. H is a -pi/4, because remember it was x minus h, which means we're shifting pi/4 to the left. So let's change our color. I made each square pi/2. Pi/4 is half of that. So I'm going to take each point and go half a space to the left. And then we're going to draw our graph. Again, try to make it curved at the top and bottom, but that's kind of hard to do sometimes. Anyway, so the blue one would be the final graph. So you start with the midline, graph the whole thing, and then you shift left to right.